Here on the third chain up here in Mesquite, this past week we've had negative tides, and if you were out on the water this past week, you experienced those opportunities like that. A lot of water gone out of our system in a lot of different areas, so it kind of opened up a little bit of some stuff. Help. The one thing that always does, once you kind of get a pattern on what these fish are doing, you get the concentration aspect of it. So when you can find the deeper edges of these reefs and these shorelines, that's kind of what your focus needs to become on when you have those lower tides like that. Like I say, the majority of the week we were negative tides all the way up until Sunday. I think we had a little bit of water come back, but we really focused in around the third chain here, these deeper edges. If you fished up in around here, you got a little bit deeper spots here on the back side of these little islands, and of course the front half of them, same thing. You got a deeper edge that's out there, and that's where we primarily kind of located our fish. And we just worked down the runway here, all the way down toward Cedar Flat, fishing that outer bar, if you would. We were trying to stay in that waist deep, fishing out a little bit deeper. Now, early mornings, we would sit up and we would get a little bit shallower and found a few fish there. But as that sun began to rise and started getting up around that 9 or 10 o'clock hour, we started creeping out there in that little bit deeper water, and we can continue to find our fish in around that type of structure and that type of depth of water. But wasn't great numbers. We found trout, still a lot of young trout that are in the systems, catching a bunch of those that are in that 10 to 14 range. A few scattered redfish that were up here on the shoreline on these edges like that. A little bit shallower. I can say early we caught a few more redfish than we did trout early. But then our trout we were catching off in that little bit deeper water, and the redfish not so much. But, keep on coming down here towards Cedar Flat, all the way down to the mouth of Cedar Bayou. All these areas that were out here on this outer edge like that. You could get up there on the flat itself. And that was some of that was pretty skinny as you got closer to the shoreline. But like I say, our depth of water that we wanted to stay in was nothing less than knee and nothing really more than waist deep. But we would fish to the deeper edges of the water to continue to locate our fish. The one thing that has happened, which we knew this was going to take place, just not so much when it was going to take place. But water temps, they're starting to creep up. They're starting to get up there in those upper 80s to start the day. And then, of course, your ambient temperature as that sun begins to get higher, and we've had lower winds. Not as many cloudy days, so that the water temp was creeping up into the low 90s in some areas. Your air temp 94, and that's going to be the continuing trend now. We're 11 days into August, so that's going to be a continuing theme as we begin to get deeper into August and into September. So you're going to want to be able to locate and find your shallower water, but it's got deeper water adjacent to it, because those fish are going to recede to that deeper and cooler water as that sun creeps up. And so you'll probably notice once you get out of your minor or your major time frame, whenever you're going to be fishing it, that those fish are starting to shut down around that 10 o'clock time frame. The bite just starts really dying off. So, we've tried to find trout early, from daybreak until about 9, give it a good, 3 hours if we could to locate fish in and around these types of areas. And then we just kind of trying to go find the redfish after that. That's kind of been the game plan this past week. It's been pretty consistent with that. So that's kind of what we have stuck with. Being in the big moon, this past week we were transitioning into that. So we stayed with smaller baits, smaller profiles, double D in various flavors. We threw the burner shad quite a bit, the down south one, the original down south, and that smaller version of it, the knock and tail. Mirror lure Little Johns was another one. We were throwing a lot of those. Incorporated a few soft dines. The soft dine is if you've used those before, they're a small bait, small profile bait, very effective. Those fish were really apt to want to eat that. So that, and then the little softy by Pav Lures, we were throwing that. That's very reminiscent of what the soft dine looks like, just different flavors by them. It's a little bit different look, a little bit different action, but the end result was the same. We were finding fish with it and catching fish with those as well. So if you don't have any of the Pav lures, go check those out. It's a terrific little bait. The colors that we were mainly sticking with this past week were white ice, bone diamond, watermelon red, the twisted tea. Twisted tea did pretty good for us this past week. The truth in the mirror lure Little Johns, watermelon red in the Little Johns. Now, we were throwing the soft dines. I just pretty much stick with just a mullet flavor, gray sides and the black back on it with the eyes, and that was pretty effective with that. Now, we weren't catching just a ton of fish with it, but when we were catching, they were pretty aggressively stroking that thing. So redfish, they like them. The only problem with the redfish is that being a soft dine, you might want to have a few extra of those because they don't last very long, especially if you get into a little batch of where you maybe got some overs. And we have noticed a lot of that too on some of these shorelines. We've catching quite a few redfish that are in the over slot. They're in that 30 to 34 inch range, and they pretty much obliterate those soft dines. You get maybe one or two, maybe three fish if you're lucky, and then it's pretty much toast. So if you're going to fish with that in the upcoming week or beyond, just remember to have a couple of extras with those because they will tear them up. So that's pretty well what we just kind of worked these areas like that, working that hard pack, the grass, shale, still an area that you want to be in and around, like up around the third chain off that shale edges there. We found a bunch of trout in and around that location. And then, of course, our redfish were coming more off the shoreline as we worked down the runway in that area down toward Cedar Flat. But the majors and the minors were majorly the minor setting with that full moon was when our best opportunities were really coming as far as fish being caught. And then, of course, once we got out of that time frame, the bite became less and less and less. So you really just kind of have to work and just stay with that smaller profile in and around that big moon. That gives you a longer opportunity to find and catch fish. But if you like to kind of venture out and throw a little bit bigger bait, if you're not trying to find numbers as quality, then you have to throw you a little bit bigger bait on there. You may have to grind a little bit longer, but typically what will happen is when you do come across one that eats it, it will be possibly is going to be a pretty decent fish. So that's kind of been what the trend has been for us this past week. Here on the Mott, coming off the point here of the Big Island, again with our lower tides, negative tides this past week, we stayed on the outer edge or outside of where all the duck blinds are. If you fished up there in the Mott area or Long Reef Bend all the way up toward Jaybird, you know where all the duck blinds are, and there's a bar that sits out there. So we stayed to the bay side of that bar, fished that deeper grass beds that were out there, located some fish in and around that area like that. We fished it all the way up to Jaybird Point, fished Jaybird Reef, all this area up in here, all the way down, kind of headed toward Spalding. We didn't necessarily get into Spalding. We tried to stay on the outside of Sherman's, fished the gut that goes into Sherman's, and then worked our way on the outer edge of this grass line that's out here. So you can wade that out pretty far to what your comfort level is anyway. So we found and locate fish that were out there in that deeper water. And we tried to get on the water by 6:30 at the latest. Sunrise isn't happening at that point, but you got enough light that you can navigate. We noticed as we were running across Aransas Bay there, because I was putting in at Copano Bay Bridge, when you do that, you've got a bunch of reefs that are out there in the middle of Aransas. So with the negative tides that come into play, some of those exposed, great little locations to fish. And like I say, there's still fish that are holding up on the reefs. You may have to hop a little bit from reef to reef to reef. And there's some that are out there that are pretty close by that you can get to pretty quickly, so you're not going to waste a whole lot of time running a long way. You got Spalding Reef that's in here as well, this area. That's had some fish on it. Of course, the fingers of Carlos are just right there. So if you did not locate some fish on one of those, you would, if you got to the next set of reefs or guts, if you will, you could find some fish somewhere. So we found fish in all those different locations. Not every reef had fish that we were fishing on, but we did find some that were still hanging on. Pretty decent fish. They're in that 15 to 18 range. The trout were. Redfish wise, if we located, they were more close to the shoreline, not necessarily on the reefs. And then every once in a while, pull out a black drum because, they're not real big on eating artificial baits. But it's always a good little surprise when you do find one that eats it. Main baits that we were using, same one that I mentioned, white ice, bone diamond, twisted tea, big papa, watermelon red, a lot of the burner shad. We were throwing in that. I think, our water clarity was good because we didn't have big winds this past week. Everything was pretty mild as far as wind goes. There was a couple of days where it was almost not any wind. So water clarity was pretty good. So we throw some firecracker and a little bit more translucent bait. Golden red glitter was good for us. Kitchen sink and the mirror lure, Little John was good. The Truth was another one that was good. The knock and tail one in the greenback and the heavy metal and rogue all did pretty well. And then we factored in the Pav lure, which is the little softy, and then the soft dine as well, because that smaller profile bait was what was the ticket for us this past week. We really spent a lot of time with those smaller profile baits and did pretty good production wise. Now it wasn't just like huge numbers, but it seemed like the fish that we were catching were a little bit better quality. You still had your dinkers that were mixed in there, some 10 to 12s, but most of them were better fish for the most part. We just worked in and around that, especially around the minor. Early in the week, the minor was early mornings, but as we got later in the week, that minor started setting up for us really well. So that's when we found the majority of our fish is in around that time frame when that moon was setting and the sun was starting to rise. So this upcoming week, it'll be even better. That moon will be setting a little bit later in the morning, so it'll give you a little bit longer time frame to find and catch you some fish, depending on where you're going to fish at. So just make sure that you have deeper water access close by to where you're fishing as that temperature begins to rise, because that's starting to be a common theme now as we get further into August. Our water temps in some of these areas, kind of down towards Spalding area, starting to get a little bit closer to the low 90s, 92, 93, 94. So trying to get off the water no later than 1 o'clock, because after that, man, it becomes a real big grind trying to find and catch those fish that want to eat. So just kind of set your week up accordingly. Pay attention to what your weather patterns are going to be, because that's all going to be part of your factor for your tactics for this upcoming fishing week. Over here in St. Charles, I haven't been in St. Charles very much, dog. I try to stay out of the St. Charles Bay system during the summertime. Just so many of those big lizards that are hanging out in and around these areas up in there. So it kind of becomes a little leery. So we spent a day up in here. We started out here in East Pocket. Again, the day that we tried to spin up in here, it was pretty shallow back in there with those negative tides. So we didn't really get as back far as what we'd like. But we got in and around, get on the back side here, across from the boat ramp, and just kind of worked our way down this. Now, this particular shoreline right in here, as you head up toward Egg Point, it's a really good shoreline. That one's got a lot of grass on it. You got some great pockets that are in there. We found a lot of fish that were hanging out on this shoreline. It was really pretty productive for us for the most part. But I get kind of leery when I get in there because I'm constantly looking around, so I don't want those little suckers sneaking up on me. So, but we did have had a productive day the day that we did spend in here and spent some time on it. The majority, if you fish St. Charles a lot or even a little bit, the majority of your shell is all up toward the front. That's where a lot of shell. There's a little gas well that's out there in the middle of the front half of St. Charles. Once you pass that and you head toward the back, whether you head down Cavasso or Big and Little Sharp or Boy Scout Camp, that area, there's not much shell back in there. You have a little scattered pieces here and there, but not like you do up front. So we kind of tried to stick to that mostly. Then, of course, here on the Big Tree Road, down there, you got all those shell bars that are out there, and we worked in around those because it really sets up good for you there with these lower tides. It doesn't necessarily expose those reefs, but you're able to fish them easier because typically that water that's around those reefs is fairly deep when it's a normal tide, so you might be uncomfortable fishing it because some of it can get to about your chest deep, which is kind of uncomfortable. I don't like to fish chest deep, but the fish were kind of dictating that that's where they wanted to be in and around that type of structure or on that shell. Over here on Cow Chip, this area down here on this shoreline, all this up in here is really hard packed. You got some scattered shell that's on it, and of course you get around to Ernest Point. That's a big old hard packed sandbar that's out there. So we fished that outer edge of that back toward where the shell bar or shell reefs are, back toward the Big Tree Road, all back in this area here. And so that's, over on the Egg Point side, over that grass. Like I say, lots of great pockets. You got some edges that are out there. You got some humps in there. You got some little depressions that are in there. So we kind of located some fish that were up and down that shoreline. And of course, we found some in and around the shell as well. Again, same baits, smaller profile baits. Always when you get around that big moon. So we'll be on the backside of the big moon this upcoming week, and then we'll get into those transition days. But even in the transition days, I will continue to throw the smaller profile baits just to see if you can't find your fish on that profile. Again, the same baits. We incorporated some double D that were in there as well, especially around those that shell, because you really kind of bang that thing down there. It kind of bounces off that shell, and get you some good reactionary strikes off of that. And then a lot of the burner shad. The water was pretty clean for the most part, so we incorporated some more translucent like the Firecracker, Golden Red Glitter, and the Little John. Your other ones that's White Ice and Bone Diamond were in there. Watermelon Red's always good. It doesn't seem to matter what time of year that is. Watermelon Red seems to catch fish. But that's kind of where we were playing as far as what our tactics were for the upcoming this past week. In the knock and tail, it was the greenback and the heavy metal mostly. Rogue sprinkled in there as well, somewhat. And then the soft dines, and then the little pav lure. It's a pretty good little bait. It's got really good action on it. So if you haven't thrown pav lures, you can pick some up locally, or go to their website and get that if you'd like. But it's a great bait. If you don't have those in your box, you might want to add those to it, especially as we're getting closer. Each little day that we're getting a little closer toward the fall of the year. So, 2 months out, man, we'll be sitting here in October expecting or hoping we'll have a first little cool front that'll come through, and that'll change the game for us quite a bit. But to get us through August, you're going to have practice a little patience, because there may be some grind days where it just doesn't a great bite whatsoever. That's always an anticipation of things that happen. It's just part of it. But like I say, you just have you some deep water access close to the area that you're trying to fish, because those fish will recede to that deeper water because it's cooler for them. And you can find and locate your fish in those types of areas once your bite kind of dies off up in your shallower water.